our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. In today's episode, we're going to talk about ethics. Do journalists have them? What do they look like? And then we'll have a little game where you get to decide how ethical I was when I was a reporter. Sound good? Let's get unspun. But before we get started, I have an important announcement to make. It's just about my 1-year anniversary for the Unspun podcast, and I have a present for all of you. Around the 1st of next month, that'll be October 2024, I'm going to be doing a live stream with as many listeners as want to come. We'll do some games, try to identify some logic problems, I'll answer your questions, all of those things. And I'm going to be sending invitations to people who are subscribed to my Substack, which is at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. I'll say that one more time. It's TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. So, if you haven't subscribed to the free newsletter there, and it's completely free, you'll want to go ahead and do that so you can get an invitation to the live stream. And with that, we'll get unspun. So what makes someone a journalist? Think about that for a second. There was a time not too long ago when listening to answers at a press conference was the domain of a privileged few who got press credentials. When sharing them meant that you had an FCC license for broadcasting or owned a printing press. Things that almost nobody had. And obviously things are really different now. There are folks who make their living watching a camera feed of a press conference and just posting those clips online. And a free WordPress site or a TikTok account is my printing press or my broadcast station. The barrier for sending information to the masses is so low that it's pretty much gone now. And that can really be a good thing from a power perspective. You don't have to already have capital to have a voice. But it can also be a very bad thing because the expectation that information that's news is, true, doesn't always have an industry behind it. One of the things I'd say makes someone a journalist is sort of a contract that we teach my journalists in training, things we do as journalists to serve the audience who give us their attention and trust. And professional journalists have a pretty extensive code of ethics that they learn about in school and agree to follow in their careers. It's detailed. And I'm going to go through some highlights right now, but I'll put a link to the whole thing in the show notes. Or you can find it yourself at spj.org. That's S as in Sam, P as in potato, J as in Jordan.org. The Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics is like a roadmap for ethical journalism, and it helps ensure that journalism stays fair and accurate and accountable. Here's what it says. First up is seek truth and report it. And this really emphasizes the importance of both accuracy and fairness. So imagine if a news outlet rushes to publish a sensational story without verifying the facts. Honestly, you don't even have to imagine it, right? It's happening all the time when outlets try to cover things on social media. So the information gets your attention, but it might not turn out to be true. And so, if you're in the audience, how do you feel if the truth is sacrificed for a headline? Sometimes seeking truth means taking your time to verify the information. And that can be frustrating for the audience that's waiting to find out what's going on, but it is what ethical journalists do. The second thing means not being afraid to report what you find out. And this actually, honest, can be harder than it seems, especially when the journalist is doing their job of speaking truth to power. I mean, imagine if you were the person who has to tell the truth about the president, when he can then get your press credentials taken away. And this has become so difficult, as accusations of fake news mean that sometimes journalists are actually physically attacked. If you think back to January 6th, when a mob pushed their way into the U.S. Capitol, they first physically attacked nearly 20 journalists and destroyed thousands of dollars of gear. Reporting without fear isn't as easy as it seems. Another principle is protecting sources. Sometimes you have people who have important information, but it's really risky for them to talk to you. You saw this with the Arlington National Cemetery employee who declined to pursue charges after she said political campaign officials shoved her. She was afraid of what that campaigner's followers might do. And other times it's a corporate whistleblower who's afraid for their job. And in those cases, the journalist may promise not to reveal their source. And journalists take these promises seriously, especially when it comes to protecting their sources, because it means helping those folks who provide valuable information do so safely. But this can be a whole can of worms. I mean, think about it. What do you think when you hear that a source isn't named? Does it make you a little suspicious? How do you know those sources are even real? So I tell my students that first and foremost, do everything you can to get a source to allow you to use their name. But I also tell my students not to promise confidentiality unless you'd be willing to go to jail yourself to keep that information secret. And that does happen sometimes. I'll put a link to the show notes to the Reporters Committee of Freedom of the Press's list of reporters who have done just that. So you can take, for example, in 2001, author Vanessa Leggett from Houston, Texas, spent 168 days in prison. She was investigating and writing for a true crime book, and she was asked to disclose her research and identify her sources to a federal grand jury. She declined, so the judge actually jailed her for contempt of court. She was released later, but it was just on procedural grounds. The grand jury completed its term, so there was no way for her to testify. And it turned out that a later grand jury was able to charge a key suspect in the murder without requiring her to testify. She told the Associated Press she'd go back to jail to protect her source if she had to, saying, "This is not so much about me, it's about the public's right to a free and independent press." Now, another important aspect to ethics for journalists is to minimize harm, which is all about treating people with sensitivity wherever you can. And sometimes journalists see people at their worst moments. They see them standing right outside their flooded house, or after they find out they've been swindled, for example. And I can tell you, it is hard to ask questions of people at that time. One of the first things you think about is if you really need to. You know, if you see someone crying outside their burning home, do you really need a quote from them telling you they're feeling sad? This can be a tough one depending on the kind of work that you do. If I'm writing a story that's mostly going to be told in text, that quote isn't as important because I can make the moment feel alive for my audience in the way that I, as the reporter on the scene, describe it. If the story's told in video, those quotes can add emotion to the story and help the audience to feel the impact. Honestly, you can make people feel impact with an image. Here, I'll give you an example. I was working on a piece about some very impoverished people in a Central American country. The people who were living there were refugees who had immigrated to the country from another one, and they were essentially making a living by digging out the side of a muddy hill to make rooms which became their homes of sorts. And the most poignant thing I saw was a toy. It was a child's teddy bear that they had left outside that was near the door of a home. It was stomped down into the mud, but it was still smiling with a little glint in its hard black bead eye. Looking out for a good image kind of led to a visual metaphor for the experience that those refugees had. I didn't have to interview a child and ask them what it was like leaving their relatives and country to tell the story. I could get the information on the journey from less vulnerable people and let the picture give the child's perspective. But I will say that doing that takes a lot of time to find the best images, and when news staffs are now very, very small, that kind of time is really hard to come by. But that extra effort is part of that ethic of minimizing harm. And after a week when there's been a new focus on one country's government paying influencers in another country, maybe we need more of an emphasis on the next ethical item from that SPJ code, which is to act independently. This principle is all about being impartial and avoiding places where you might have conflicts of interest. Basically, journalists should refuse gifts or favors or any special treatment that might compromise their integrity. More than that, it's a good idea for journalists not to cover issues where they have a stake or even just a very strong feeling. So here's an example. When I was a reporter, I used to cover the crime beat. So that meant covering the police department, covering the sheriff's office, fire, and also the judicial system. Now, personally, I have a lot of strong feelings about capital punishment. And the state where I was working did use capital punishment as an option in trials and did execute people. When there was an execution coming up, because of my strong personal feelings in the matter, I was probably not the best person to go and write about it. It would be very hard for me to be rational and unbiased about that particular issue. So, someone who worked in one of the bureaus, which is an off-site office in a smaller area from the city where I worked, would go and cover executions. And I think you should know that this way of avoiding bias has gotten really hard. If I were the only option to cover that story, I would do my best to be unbiased. But there was also at least one or sometimes two checks on my stories before they got printed. There'd be a section editor, in that case the city news section, who would read over my story and try to check for bias. And for stories that were likely to have a lot of kind of heightened emotion, the managing editor, that section editor's boss, would sometimes read the story over as well. And I gotta tell you, that is less true now, and there's two reasons why. First of all, the size of the reporting staff is smaller, so there may not be an extra person from a bureau to come in and cover something. But also, because the news goes straight to the public now, because people want to know what's going on right away, in some cases the reporters are actually sharing the news on social media or posting to the website directly without anybody else reviewing it before you see it. There is no check, and that brings up some real issues based on who reporters are and how that affects the kind of news that you see. But in any case, ethically, a professional journalist is supposed to make every effort to be independent. The last part of the code is to be accountable and transparent. And this means that journalists should take responsibility for their work. If they make mistakes, they should acknowledge them and they should correct them right away. This has also gotten a lot more complicated. Now, I'm going to tell you, journalists do make mistakes. Honestly, people in every industry make mistakes. For journalists, those mistakes can really directly affect people's lives. And they try, but still, they screw up sometimes. When you're in a hurry, for example, when you're covering something in little bursts on Twitter/X, it's harder to be perfectly accurate. And sometimes the context doesn't become clear until after the event or the speech or whatever it is that you're covering. If you screw it up, you would correct it on the platform where you published it. But with the nature of scrolling news feeds and the fact that people don't just sit and look at their phones 24 hours a day, people may never even see the correction. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. But if you let me editorialize for a second, I will say I feel like the industry needs to think about how to do corrections better. These things sound easy, but they aren't always easy in practice. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, it's your turn. I'm going to give you several ethical dilemmas that I faced when I was reporting, and I'm going to ask you to think about if I was ethical or not, and then I'll tell you what I did. I'll be right back. Sometimes practicing ethics is very easy. One place people like to talk about is images. So here's an example. When O.J. Simpson was on trial accused of murdering his wife and Ron Goldman, he was pretty famous. So his mugshot was on the cover of the popular news magazines at the time, Time, U.S. News, and Newsweek. And if you ever go by a newsstand, you know that they sometimes display the covers side by side. And when you looked at Time and Newsweek that week, you saw a big difference in how the two covers looked. Newsweek ran the photo pretty much as it was. Time, on the other hand, actually hired a photo illustrator to manipulate the image. Simpson looks, well, darker, with more severe shadows, and some critics have said he just looks more guilty. That kind of image manipulation seems unethical, right? Yeah, because ethics are easy. And in the same way, 3 years later, it was Newsweek's turn when they ran a picture of a famous mother of septuplets named Bobby McCoy. Time ran a similar photo of her with her husband. In Time's photo, you can see that her teeth are not straight. But on Newsweek, she's had a visit to the digital dentist via software, and she's got straight white teeth in her smile. So that's unethical. Just like when National Geographic moved two of the Great Pyramids of Giza closer together in a photo to make a horizontal picture fit on their vertical cover. Not great ethics, because ethics are easy, right? Well, maybe. It's not just photos, though. Before I went to graduate school, I was a newspaper reporter in a small city in the South. I started as the feature writer, and someone else covered City Hall. So this takes a little bit of background, but basically, when a city government has stuff to discuss that isn't necessarily everyone's business, they can sometimes go into what's called an executive session. So maybe, for instance, the city secretary has not done a great job this year, but the city manager thinks it's because her husband has cancer and still wants her to get a raise. The council can hear privately about the cancer as long as they announce in advance that they're going to talk about salaries and they don't actually vote on the salary in private. So that's an executive session. It's the ability to talk about some things in private as long as you take all the action in public. Okay. The guy who covered City Hall before I did got in some real trouble with executive session. He was a suspicious kind of guy. You know, the type who low-key believed some conspiracy theories. The guy who covered it was convinced that the city council would have secret discussions during executive session that he ought to be able to find out about so he could learn what was really going on. So during one meeting at a kind of important time, he actually went in and put a tape recorder in the trash can in the council chambers. At the time, tape recorders were not digital. Instead, they were little cassettes of magnetic tape, and although the recorder was pretty small, When it hit the end of that little tab, it would let you know by cutting off with a pretty loud click. So imagine the surprise of the council members and the mayor when they were at a quiet point in their discussion and all of a sudden the trash can went click. That's clearly wrong, right? Ethics are easy. Until they aren't. Back in the 90s, there was a guy named Ted, and Ted had some feelings about technology. I wouldn't say he was a fan of it. And he expressed his dislike for technology by sending bombs through the mail to people who worked for technology companies and people who worked in computer science departments at some prominent universities. His name was Ted Kaczynski, and he called himself the Unabomber. In 1995, Kaczynski wrote a letter to the New York Times, and he said, "If you or the Washington Post will print this long essay about the evils of technology that I've enclosed, I will stop sending mail bombs." In the essay, he explained that he did bad things like bombings to get people to notice how technology was taking away freedom and dignity. So what do you think? If you were the editor, would you publish it? I think the ethics are not as clear here. I do ask my students what they think about the pros and cons of publishing. So what do you think are the pros? One of the pros would be that it's probably news that this figure has been on your page for a long time and now he's written to you. Right? It might have news value. Another pro, and this may feel a little crass to you, but you will sell a lot of papers when you publish this. You could also argue that it's in the public interest to know exactly what it is that he's saying. So what are the cons? I think the con is pretty obvious. If someone can send you a letter and get you to publish all of their ideas, because in the past they did bad things like blowing people up, if you publish it, you may be incenting other people who have a grievance, who have an idea, to commit acts of violence in hopes that you'll publish them too. You saw this in the U.S. in the 1970s when people used to go to TV stations with guns so that they could get on the air and talk about what they wanted to talk about. You don't want to become the aggrieved person weekly, and so that's a pretty big con to publishing. Well, back at the time, the FBI and Attorney General Janet Reno wanted the essay to be in the newspaper. So the Washington Post did publish it in September of 1995. And when Ted's brother David read it, he realized it sounded like his brother's writing style. So he told the FBI about his suspicions, and eventually they were able to capture him. And in fact, there were no more bombs. So it was a good outcome. But I'm not sure that the ends justify the means. I thought I would close out today with a few examples of potential conflicts of interest that I faced when I was reporting. I worked for a small city daily in South Carolina when I first started my career. I was the feature writer, which meant that in our small city, a lot of my stories were about slice-of-life kind of things. Someone who had a nice garden, a club that was making a difference in people's lives, that kind of thing. I was also just out of college poor and working for a newspaper, so it was pretty exciting for me when I got asked to write a restaurant story. I can tell you that long ago it was pretty common for media who were doing reviews to be the guest of the thing being reviewed. So one example might be going to a restaurant where they would give you your food for free. And another example was something I actually heard from a guest speaker in one of my journalism classes, who was the entertainment reporter for the local paper. And he talked about these press junkets that they had around major films. In those days, the studio would pay to fly you out to Hollywood. You'd stay in the fabulous Beverly Hilton of game show fame. You'd go to some swanky parties that had the actual movie stars who were in the film, and then you'd watch the film with a bunch of other critics. And then you'd go home and write your review. This is not the way it works in journalism anymore. There's no free meals, there's no free trips to go hang out with movie stars, any of those things. And I think if you think about it for like half a second, you can kind of see the obvious problem. After you've met that nice Tom Cruise, how can you possibly say his performance wasn't any good in the movie? So times had changed by the time I was working. But we did have an exciting new restaurant show up. Its name was Lilfred's. And secretly, it wasn't actually a new restaurant, but it was a reimagining of a place that had been a filling station that served food way back in the 1950s, and it was serving up fried chicken and coleslaw. It was kind of on the route to get to Myrtle Beach from the central United States at the time before they built the interstate highway system. Anyway, Lilfred's was open again, so I went to check it out. Great ethics I had, of course, so the newspaper paid for my meal, and I got to go with my husband and enjoy some different seafood dishes, and I did not tell anyone on the staff that I was there with the newspaper when I went. The next day, I had an appointment and went in and interviewed the chef owner. And what a nice and interesting guy he was. He told me about his past, having apprenticed in some pretty great restaurants, about how reopening Lilfred's felt like coming home in a way. He showed me his extensive herb garden where he grew these beautiful, bounteous plants that went into his dishes, and his equally impressive wine cellar, because in one of those apprenticeships he had, he really learned about pairing food with wine. He was such a nice guy. He was about my age, kind of person you really hit it off with, and I felt like we could actually even be friends. So the wine cellar tour was one of the last things we did. And we're standing there, and I'm talking to him and writing things down in my little reporter notebook, and he reaches over and grabs several bottles of wine and hands them to me and says, "Here, you'd like these. Why don't you take them and try them?" So here's the moment when I ask, what should I do? Should I take his wine? I've asked my students over the years to name the pros and cons. One pro, they'll usually say, free wine. Maybe another pro, just like I sampled the food, maybe I should sample the beverages too. And another possible pro that they'll say sometimes, no one's going to know that I took this wine from him. Now the cons. Isn't that like the studio showing me the movie? Having maybe meeting the movie stars? My students sometimes want to argue that no one's going to know, but what if someone does? And even if I think I can be objective, which they suggest sometimes as well, can I really? Do you think I took the wine? I did not take his wine. I have to tell you, this very nice person that I really hit it off with was very, very deeply offended. He assumed, reasonably I think, that I was accusing him of trying to bribe me. But because he could benefit financially from having a nice review, and let me say my review was already going to be nice because I really did enjoy my experience at his restaurant, it was just too much of a risk. I couldn't take the wine, and maybe I lost a potential friend. But anyway, let's go on to the next example. So like I said, I did a lot of writing about people and gardens and that kind of thing. And there was a really interesting one. In town, there was a high-rise building that was homes for senior citizens. You can think of it like a bunch of nursing homes stacked on top of each other. And in between the parking lot for that high-rise building and a pretty big divided highway was a grassy median. And over a period of a few weeks, the grass disappeared and was replaced by what became the most interesting-looking vegetable garden. There were stalks of corn reaching for the sky and giant leaves under which there were zucchinis and pumpkins. And so I did some checking, and I found out that it was actually one of the residents of the senior citizen high-rise who was planting and maintaining that garden. And you have to imagine this. There was no irrigation. So using his cane, he would walk out there with his gardening tools. He took up all the grass, he dug holes, he planted seeds, he hand-carried water out there every day. And he would pick the vegetables and he would give them to the staff at the home who cared for him so well. Just a lovely, lovely feature story. Best of humanity. And so I interviewed him. We stood out in his garden between the parked cars on one side and the cars whizzing by at 55 miles an hour on the other. And he told me about how he'd always loved being outdoors, about how this was a real labor of love for him. And I was getting ready to leave, and he stepped over to one of those giant zucchini leaves and he lifted it up, and behind it was a wicker basket filled with fresh vegetables. "Here," he said, "these are for you." Can I take his vegetables? What do you think? Maybe we'll start with the cons this time. I'm not supposed to take gifts. How would it look if I was taking this right out on the side of the road in front of everybody? The pros? My students sometimes point out he was not a young man, and if he felt like I was accusing him of trying to influence me, even if that isn't really what I mean, it might actually, kill him. And besides, he's not going to make money based on whether I take his vegetables, and it's not like he can put the zucchini back on the plant like the guy could put the bottle of wine back in the wine cellar. So what do you think? Did I take his vegetables? I did take his vegetables, and to be honest, I feel a little bit bad about it to this day. I still have the basket. And in the moment, I didn't feel like I could insult a nice old man who was trying to do a good thing. I have one more example. The place where I lived was a right-to-work state, which means that everybody's employed at will and it's very hard to have a union. And that can be good for people having jobs because companies do like to do business in those kind of states. It can also be bad for workers because when a company needs to close a branch or a plant, they will go to the right-to-work state first because it's less expensive to do so. In this town where I was working, there was a Campbell soup plant that made Swanson chicken and turkey dinners. So you can imagine, Trucks of chickens and turkeys went in one end of the plant, and frozen chicken and turkey dinners came out the other. Campbell's was not making as much money as they wanted, so they needed to close a plant, and they decided to close this one. It is hard to describe the impact on a small town of having your major employer close. It impacts everybody in the town because everybody is interdependent. And at the newspaper, we ran stories for more than a year about this impact, about people moving away so the schools got smaller, and that was an education story. There were follow-on layoffs when other companies couldn't sell things to the Campbell's plant anymore. Since I was the feature writer, I got to write a kind of a happy story. So I wrote a story about this nice lady who had worked as a chicken eviscerator at the plant. She lost her job, and she decided to start her own home craft business. So she would take little teddy bears, and she would make costumes for them that represented different professions. So for example, you might have a teacher bear who was holding a blackboard and a pointer, or you might have a doctor bear who had a stethoscope and a prescription pad, that kind of thing. She would make them in her home workshop, and then she would sell them at craft fairs. So I went and toured her factory in her garage, and I saw how she made the bears, and I interviewed her about how much faith in herself it took to try and start this business at her age, because she was getting near retirement, about the kind of reception that her bears got at craft fairs and that kind of thing. And as we were getting near the end of the line of the toy workshop, she handed me a teddy bear dressed as a journalist. "Here," she said, "I made this for you." Should I take her bear? What do you think? We could think about the pros and cons again. So a pro would be that I would not insult this sweet older lady. Possibly this is an item that she couldn't really undo. Kind of like you can't put a zucchini back on the vine. Turning this into a different kind of bear doll or something would be difficult, maybe not even possible. But a really big one is that she would make money off of a nice story, or at least she could, right? Because, she could look for getting extra business from people who saw and recognized her at local craft fairs. So what do you think I did? I still feel bad about this, but I did take the bear, and I can put a picture of it in the show notes. It brings up an important point for journalists, which is you should know how you're going to act in different ethical situations before they come up. You don't want to be making a decision while you're standing there juggling several bottles of wine or while you're standing there looking at the bear itself. In the same way, you want to think about if you're going to try to get an interview with somebody who's obviously very upset, or if you're going to try to answer that email from a complaining reader, or if you're going to promise anonymity to a source. Thinking about these things in advance lets you act with integrity. The same in every situation. And guides like the SPJ Code of Ethics can give you and the audience some confidence for how a journalist that you read or watch might be approaching their work. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.